Welcome to the Daniel and Enoch podcast. I am a pastor. Daniel is an engineer. We are two men who love Jesus and long to think well about God and life. Today, we're going to have a conversation about friendship. Our society is in the midst of what some people have called a friendship recession. Friendship, with almost every other type of social relationship in our world today, has declined over the past several decades. Both men and women report having fewer friends today, but studies have shown that men have experienced the biggest friendship decline. Last year, the LA Times reported that in a lonely world that keeps getting lonelier, men on average are the loneliest. 30 years ago, a majority of men, meaning 55%, reported having at least 6 close friends. And today that number has been cut in half, according to survey data. And they also say that 15% of men reported having no close friendships at all, a 5-fold increase since 1990. Well, neither Daniel or I would claim to be experts about friendship, but we are friends. When we lived in DC, we were roommates for 2 years together. And while we live in different states today, we have traveled to see each other, and we have maintained our friendship for more than 10 years now. So in our episode today, you're going to see two friends talking about friendship. Well, Daniel, I want to begin our conversation today by just thinking about some of the barriers that we encounter with friendship. We talked about some of the decrease of friendship, particularly with men, but why in our culture, in our society today, does it seem harder than ever to make and maintain quality friendships?
I think there are a bunch of compounding reasons that have resulted in this rise of loneliness. I think maybe it just begins with the question of what is friendship. Some people would say that friendship is just the people who you know by name. And some people would say that friendship begins as a sort of lower level romantic relationship, or at least a relationship in where the potential of romance exists if you're talking about someone you might be sexually attracted to. And so in both of those categories, it's possible to say, well, I have friends and yet be incredibly lonely, and to be missing some of the things that historically have belonged to the category of friendship. And those issues are compounded pretty dramatically by the technological circumstances that we live in. It is a tremendous blessing to be able to communicate over long distances so easily. I mean, this podcast can exist because of the technology exists. At the same time, it lets people live under the illusion that they have friendships when they don't actually have friendships. The people who like your Instagram posts, or even perhaps comment on your Facebook page, are not necessarily your friends. But we still get a little bit of that dopamine, whenever we get that kind of engagement and interaction. The problem is that when life gets hard, or when we're in a tough spot, those relationships don't materialize into anything else. They don't result in meaningful conversations. But yeah. Another factor is, we live in a society that defines freedom as autonomy. So it's not the freedom to do something, but rather the freedom from anyone else making any claim on your affection. Or your time or your energy or whatever else. And so to some degree, a real friendship, just like a real romance or parenting a child, obligates you to some people in a certain way. And people would say, well, if I'm obligated to someone else, I'm not free. And I want to be free. That's what it means to be human. So I can't really have any deep, meaningful friendships. We are encouraged to treat a lot of our relationships as transactional. I only need to be in this relationship as long as it's meeting all my needs and it's checking all my boxes, and I'm getting what I want. And society gives us a blank check to leave relationships that we feel aren't fulfilling or meaningful in some ways. And friendship is particularly fragile under those conditions because friendship is a relationship that is opted into by both people on the basis of some other interest. So, you have people that love the church, and so they're friends because they enjoy the same kinds of ministry, or people who are friends because certain kinds of books they like certain kinds of books, or even other types of hobbies or things. And so you can choose to be friends with people who share those interests, but you're friends because you both love the same things, you both care about the same things. There's not quite as much tangible hard benefits from being in a friendship as there are potentially from being in a romantic relationship, which obviously has a physical component at some level. But even if you think about parents and children, obviously the children derive a lot of benefits from their parents. But parents also derive an important sense of meaning and purpose, and a sense of being loved by raising their kids. Friendship is a little bit more ephemeral, and is so vulnerable, is so more vulnerable to people who are treating the relationship as something that they have to get something out of in order to continue.
Hmm.
And I'll add one more that's kind of, I think, maybe a little bit more unique to conservative and religious circles, which is the fear of having your sexuality questioned. We live in an age where sexual expression has become almost the pinnacle of what it means to be human. And so your sexuality then becomes basically almost the most important thing about you. But in a lot of conservative or religious communities, there's still some taboo associated with certain behaviors. And so people don't want to appear to other members in their community as engaging in those behaviors. So they withdraw from any sort of affection or behavior or other activity, which could even just be spending a lot of time together. That might cause the other people in those communities to be like, is she a lesbian? I mean, she's spending an awful lot of time knitting, or whatever else it may be. And that closes people off to friendships because they're afraid of how that behavior might be interpreted. Well, I rattled off a bunch there, but what do you think? Are there other challenges I missed?
I'll amplify a little bit of what you're saying on that last point there, Daniel. Yeah, I think especially for men, and you suggested that this concern was primarily about conservative religious communities, but I honestly think that there are a lot of men who are outside of the church, and yet still are hesitant to have close, visibly close, observably close friendships with other men because they are still worried about it being misinterpreted, somebody thinking they're gay, for instance. So I do think that's probably a broader societal concern. And one of the things I think that should be a part of healthy friendships, which we see all throughout Scripture, all throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, actually, is that appropriate godly affection, holy affection, as the New Testament puts it, should be a factor in our friendships. And I think for a lot of people that just makes them very uncomfortable. But the truth is, friendship is deepened when you have a godly, holy affection between men or between women, and affection that's not sexual but is incredibly meaningful and important. One of the ways that I've tried to live this out in my church community, and particularly my small group, is that the guys in my group, we've all made an agreement that every time we see each other, where it's on Wednesday nights when we meet for group or on Sunday mornings, we give each other a hug every time. And that is just an incredibly rich and meaningful part of our friendship with each other that, quite frankly, has deepened that friendship. And so I think what I want to say to that is I really hope that that stigma, that inappropriate stigma, that we can really push past that. I also want to return to what you said earlier about technology and some of the ways that the technology has made it harder for us to form relationships and relate to each other. Yeah, there's this sense that social media is really unsocial media. It is relational contact that is happening without actual relationship. And when it's so much easier to engage on Facebook than it is to engage with somebody in real life, that becomes a substitute, but actually a very poor substitute for actually interacting and engaging with other people. One of the dynamics that we see that it's necessary in friendship is to have a knowledge of the good and the bad happening in our lives. On social media, it's frequently filtering out all of the bad things. We choose to highlight our vacations. We choose to highlight our family photos. We don't choose to highlight those lonely evenings. We don't often share our deepest griefs in that the social media context. And so it is by only showing the best of what's going on in our lives, it actually becomes a much shallower experience than it could be. And I also, in terms of technology, I also think the fact that we're just incredibly more mobile today. I mean, we have cars and airplanes that can take us across the country. And because we are often separated from people that we grew up with and people that we develop relationships with in the past. I mean, I'm here in the Chicago area, Daniel. You are in Atlanta. There is a distance, and that distance created in a large extent by technology, by the fact that you can work remotely for your employer, and it allows for greater disconnection in our culture today.
Definitely. Maybe it's worth mentioning the pandemic as well. That created a lot of space between people that probably uh, revealed a depth of loneliness and a weakness in relationships that people weren't even aware of. And now on the other side, we're coming out of it, but more people are realizing that the structures that used to exist to create friendships just don't exist anymore. And so the question is, how do you meet people? How do you make friends as an adult after college? And a lot of people I think are coming up empty, short of sort of uh, scrolling on your phone before bed, what have you.
Hmm.
But you mentioned men earlier and some of the particular aspects of being afraid of having their sexuality questioned. Is there anything else do you think that's unique about male friendship and why something like that might be more difficult to maintain?
Some people might say something as strong as women are just better at making and keeping friends than men. Now, I don't know if that's true necessarily. I do think there is truth in this idea that men's friendships are often made through shared purpose, shared vision, shared task. I think men often create friendships on sports teams and when they're working together on some physical task. I can think of important friendships that I developed when I had guys from church come over to my house and help me fix something that was broken, for instance. And yeah, whether it's a father and a son working on a car together, or there's this sense that kind of a common physical task or purpose really is helpful in building male friendship. I do believe that the instinctual desire that women have for relationships often leads them to pursue relationships in a way that men don't. Women, I think, are better in general at planning events and keeping in contact with people, staying in touch with friends, maybe at a distance. And I think men do struggle more when they don't have a shared task in front of them, a shared goal in front of them that they're striving for together. But I don't think that that means that men's need for friendship is any less deep than women's need for friendship is. I just think some of the relational gifts that women tend to have, um, and certainly women's friendships have a level of complexity that male friendships in general don't necessarily have. Again, not always true, but I think there's a way in which male friendship can be a little bit simpler, but not less deep. So, yeah, there are the way that men and women tend to approach friendship is different. And I do think that some of we mentioned technology just a moment ago. I think some of the physical isolation from each other that we have has made forming friendships and relationships harder on men than it is women. I do think in our technology enabled world that yeah, a man can work remotely, can game, can order food delivered to his door. And for some men, they aren't going to push themselves farther than that to actually form relationships with people in their world and their community. And I think that is often very detrimental. So I don't think the need is less, but I think maybe the instinctual drive. Another thing to mention here is that some people have often said that women form relationships face to face and men form relationships side to side. I do think that is a factor here. Again, connecting with that, some of the best conversations I've ever had have been with guys when we're taking a car ride together. And yeah, if we don't have those environments, yeah, it can be harder. Both you and I are pretty verbal guys, Daniel. We like to talk. We care about words. We read a lot. We love to have conversations. But I think a lot of guys aren't necessarily there at that place. And sitting across the table from somebody at coffee and just having a conversation isn't necessarily how most men go about it. So, in a way, we may be a little bit of the oddballs here. But yeah, those are just a few things I would say about some of the challenges that we as men have in forming friendships.
I think one of the greatest losses when we talk about friendship in the church today is the loss of friendship between people who might possibly be romantically attracted to each other, or even one person in the friend group being attracted to another person in the friend group. Because as you say, it is both difficult and dangerous, because we live in a culture that elevates romance and sexuality so high that we're often self-deceived about our own motives for pursuing these various relationships. I cannot tell you how many times I have had a conversation with men, and he tells me, that there's this very attractive girl who's at church and she's doing volunteering this or that, and he's like, I just want to be friends with her. I want to get to know her better. And I'm like, that is not what you are trying to accomplish here. And I think the church has largely said, well, because it is hard and because it is dangerous, we're just not going to do. We're not going to encourage it. We're going to even discourage it, sort of actively. But the problem is that there's a class of person out there that is attracted to the same gender that they are. And so if we say that friendships between people who might possibly experience romantic attraction are not possible, then we exclude those people, same-sex attracted people, from friendships. And if we have interpreted the Bible correctly, you and I both come from Orthodox Christian traditions where homosexual marriage is not allowed. If they're not allowed to get married and they're not allowed to be friends, then there's not a lot left for those people in our communities. The Bible presents friendship as a very strong and meaningful relationship. David and Jonathan might be the most famous example. David says that that the love of Jonathan meant more to him than the love of a woman. And that can be almost impossible to interpret coming from our cultural framework. You know, David's wives would have been people that he married because of political arrangements or sexual attraction, not because he liked them for who they are or because they had shared interests. And so, Jonathan, that friendship was a unique element for David. And there's nothing in the record or in their cultural backgrounds or in their religious backgrounds that says that they must have been sexually involved with each other. But our culture assumes that because it was that strong of a relationship, that there must have been something there, which is a denigration of the category of friendship. So if at the same time, it won't do to just say, well, if you know someone who you might be attracted to or who might be attracted to you, well, you don't have to do anything any different. You can just do whatever you do. There are some extra steps that you should, that you should be careful to perform in order to try to help the relationship stay a friendship and not burden people unnecessarily. I think the first thing I would say is that it's important that both people in that friendship, or all of the people in the friendship, because friendship is an open-ended thing, have a responsibility to make sure that the relationship stays in the category of friendship, because we live in a culture where that often treats friendship as the lobby for romance.
Yeah.
And so it's easy for people to be self-deceived about, well, we're friends, and so the next step is romance, and you sort of transition in that direction without even being aware of it. But it's not fair to put all the onus on just one person to make sure that the relationship between however many people doesn't transition into something more than friendship does. So, another thing is to you use the metaphor of women face to face and men side by side, which is interesting. C.S. Lewis uses similar language to describe the difference between romance and friendship. That in a romantic relationship, the focus is on the other person in the relationship. In a friendship, all the people in the friendship are focused on something outside of the friendship. And so that can be worth considering as the relationship moves forward. If a man were to say to me, yeah, I go hang out with this group of people and we engage in this, we like to hike, for example. But I really like Susan, and I'm going to ask Susan if she wants to go get coffee with me. At that point, there's nothing wrong with that. If she says yes and you want to go in that direction, but you need to just be aware that that is moving beyond the realm of friendship. So what do you think about that? Do you have any other tips or tricks for how a person could engage in the important work of friendship in the context of potential romantic attachment?
We not only have to be upfront with the other person about where we're at and how we're understanding this friendship, what it is and what it isn't, but I think it's also important for us to kind of proactively anticipate and just try to discern the other person's emotional state, and even put in more guardrails to honor them than might be necessary to just kind of navigate our own response to the situation. So there may be times when, yes, spending less time with somebody who is attracted to you, that you are not wishing to pursue a romantic relationship, is necessary, and that could be the most loving thing to them, quite frankly. I will say this, and I'm not sure it goes the opposite direction. I think there's different challenges there, but some of the most meaningful friendships I've been able to develop with women within the church have been with women 50 plus, women who are in a different age category than I am. I have at least three really close, significant friendships with women who fall into that category at the church that are meaningful and that are beneficial. I am just a big fan of women personally, and I really enjoy hearing their perspectives and understanding who they are as people. And so I think my life would be much less rich if I didn't have those relationships with sisters in Christ. So all that to say, this is difficult, this is messy, but it is absolutely worth it. If we do not seek out and form friendships with people in the church that there could be some potential romantic attraction there, I think we miss out on the richness, the depth that God intends for us to have in friendship. It's messy, but it's a risk worth taking, and it's worth navigating those challenges when they do arise.
I also think it's worth pointing out that there's a higher layer to this, which is, a church that encourages friendship within the biblical definitions and then struggles with the challenges that arise from that effort is going to be much better equipped to teach people and to help people be friends as the church collectively acquires a body of knowledge about friendship and what that entails. It's I think it's perfectly reasonable to expect the church to create a culture of friendship. And I think that would be incredibly attractive to the world that we live in today, in Western modern culture. If a lonely person comes in and sees a bunch of, yes, there's God willing, a bunch of married people and a bunch of children and a bunch of dating people, but also a bunch of single people, and where friendships cross every conceivable line. There's a lot in that picture of community and relationship that reflects very positively on the work that God can do in people's lives to overcome the consequences of sin separating us from each other. There's absolutely a personal benefit to doing the work of friendship, but at the community level, it's an incredibly effective evangelistic and apologetic tool to a world that's incredibly lonely and lost.
Yeah. No, Daniel, I love your heart there. I love what you're saying about that healthy friendships within the church are an apologetic. They are something that represents Christianity, defends Christianity, and commends Christianity to the world, to people who don't yet know Christ. Yeah, I long for my church, and I'm sure you long for your church to be that outpost of friendship for lonely people, regardless of their relationship status, marriage status, anything like that. I love that vision. Daniel, I began this podcast by admitting that neither of us are experts in friendship. And I'd like us to just talk a little bit about some of the ways that we struggle with friendship now. How would you say that you struggle to be a friend?
Oh man, how much time do we have to do this podcast? There's an irony here that I'm talking about this because I would actually consider myself to be pretty bad at friendships in general. I am very introverted just as a personality, but to be frank, I'm also pretty lazy and selfish, and those are things that militate against not just friendship, but any form of meaningful relationship. And so the Lord has had to do a lot of work in my life to spur me out into the community and to build those kinds of relationships. But I think as a younger person, one of the things that made friendship hard for me was the something I alluded to earlier, which is that I sort of had this assumption that friends existed to benefit me in some way. So, whether it's over a shared hobby or a sport or something, you want someone, you're lonely, so you don't want to be lonely, so you want to hang out with other people. So what that person served, that other person serves the function of making you less lonely. Well, that's something that you're getting from them, their presence. And so as soon as they start to be like, have a different opinion than you, or they have a weird habit that kind of grates against you a little bit. You're like, okay, you're not doing it for me anymore, so this is over, and I got to start over again. And if you live your life like that, you're going to be very lonely. Never mind friends. You're going to be a very lonely person in every category of life. There is I don't want to be melodramatic, but there is a sort of death that has to happen in order to be in a meaningful relationship with someone else. You have to say, sometimes you're helping me out, but sometimes I'm helping you out. And sometimes you're doing something for me, and sometimes I'm doing something for you. And then there's times where, everybody's a little bit different, and we all have our own eccentricities. And sometimes those just need to be overlooked. Like there's no moral failure in what another person's doing that just happens to grate against you for some reason. And the solution to that is to get over it. And so I think a lot of people just aren't equipped to, let me rephrase. I think in a lot of ways, I have been unequipped to handle those kinds of sacrifices, which has made friendship be a little bit difficult. There's also a level of vulnerability that has to happen for a friendship to develop. Even in the context of a shared interest, at some point you have to move down to the level where you're sharing your opinions on things. And whenever you do that, you might be wrong. And therefore you have to be subject to correction, right? It's one thing to make an observation. I really like this baseball team. It's another thing to say, I think this baseball team should do this. And then someone else says, no, I think they should do that. Well, that conflict is a direct result of your shared interests, but you have to be vulnerable enough to share that opinion in the first place. And you've got to be willing to discuss it and to receive criticism about it if the relationship's going to bear up under the weight of those differences. So it takes a pretty mature person, I think, to develop a lot of deep friendships, because there's going to be a lot of that kind of conversation and things that happen. So those are a couple of mine. What about you?
I spoke earlier about distance and how technology has enabled us to transport, to live far away from where we initially lived. And I am just not good with keeping in contact with people who live far away from me. You, as one of my friends in a different state, have, I'm sure, sensed this. But I tend to be kind of, what's in front of me is my world, and I tend to focus on people in the places where I'm currently living and staying. And I have a hard time maintaining relationships outside of that. Now, there is just a reality that when you're physically separate, that's going to be hard. But I think I could do a better job scheduling that and really being more mindful of relationships that I want to maintain over distance, and really making the effort, putting it on the calendar even, to have those conversations with people who are far away. Because there's rarely, if ever, been a time when I've connected with a friend who lives somewhere else and I've regretted having that conversation. So my experience of it is very meaningful, but I'm just not very intentional about making sure that happens. Also, I would say that, I speak a lot, I talk a lot in my ministry as a pastor. I have plenty of conversations with people, including where I guide other people how to have difficult conversations with others. But that doesn't mean that I always follow my own advice. In fact, I do struggle with having confrontational conversations. I mean, you mentioned, I don't know, sports teams a moment ago or something, but often the things that we disagree about are more significant than that. They may be political or moral or cultural, and deeply personal things. And even when you're offended by something, even when you're hurt by the behavior of somebody else, that's not an easy thing to talk about. And I am also just not good at that. That's an area I want to grow in and continue to grow in. Also, I would say And we're going to touch on this in a minute when we talk about practical tips for pursuing deeper friendship. But I'll just admit right now that I struggle with generosity, both generosity with my time and resources, and also with generosity, with money. I think I carry with myself, based on the kind of meager upbringing that I had with my family, I carry some anxiety related to finances, which has made it harder for me to be generous with others in friendship. And that's one of the things that, again, we'll talk about in a minute. Friendship costs something. And there are definitely times where, either relationally or financially, it's been harder for me to pay that cost. But I also know that paying that cost is worth it. And so, that's just a few areas where I definitely struggle with friendship.
Well, let's go on to that then and talk about some ways that we can pursue deeper, more meaningful friendships in light of all the things we've been saying.
A few things I'll just rattle off really quick here, Daniel. Physical presence is so important to building friendship, especially with men, but I think in general as well. Being a friend means being somebody who shows up. And so if you are in the place right now, our listeners, of let's say not attending church in person, maybe you watch some sermons online sometime, show up, find a local church that you can get plugged into, rub shoulders with other people, get plugged into a small group, invest in spaces, get yourself out of your bedroom, get yourself out of your home, get yourself out of your workplace, and invest in real relationships with real people where you have to make eye contact with them and get to know them, answer questions, ask questions, laugh about things together in person. Physical presence is absolutely, just really important. Daniel, you and I have both visited each other in the cities where we currently live. I'm going to be visiting you again this fall. I just think physical presence is really important. I mean, presents are nice too, like on your birthday or whatever. But just being present in person is something I think you just can't get away from, even with all the video conferencing technology that we have today. I think it's still essential to be with somebody in person. Another thing I would say is, a lot of times, again, us as guys wait for somebody else to take the initiative to make a plan, to have a game night, to get together with friends, to have a conversation. We need to stop waiting for other people to do those things, and we need to do those things ourselves. We need to be more assertive in pursuing the friendships that are going to sustain us through life. That requires intentionality, that requires scheduling, but that's something we can do. There are great tools like Google Calendar that can help us do that more effectively. But yeah, just putting it on the schedule, prioritizing it with our time, just planning it. Don't wait for somebody else to do it yourself. Also, we can be the people who take the conversation deeper, from the conversation about sports, from the conversation about our thoughts on the political situation in our country today. Those are abstract conversations that are easier to have than, I've been really discouraged this week, or, this project at work has just been sucking the life out of me. And I'm really lonely. Those are things that take the conversation from a superficial level to a level that's deeper and more meaningful. One of the dynamics about friendship, and I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, Daniel, is that simply being physically present with somebody and even talking with somebody does not mean you have a deep, rich friendship. Deep, rich friendships are friendships that cost you something. And they are relationships where you are having conversations about important issues that in a vulnerable way. It's not going to be comfortable all the time. And that's something I think we just need to recognize and embrace that challenge. Daniel, would you have anything to add about how we can pursue friendships in a healthier way?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's worth saying that this is that being a good friend and learning how to make friends is a learned skill. I think it can be interesting if you observe young children and how they interact with each other, how it's instinctive, how they will often form some kind of relationship so they can play tag or whatever. But adults are more complicated as human beings, and so it takes a little bit more work. But it's the kind of thing you can practice at. So going back to your first point about presence, one of the things that's I think interesting about that concept is that you communicate so much more when you're physically in the same room with someone. So if you're just chatting online, all you have is the words. But if you are physically present with someone, you have the words, you have the tone and inflection, you have the way they look, the way they dress, the way they act, the body language. There's so much more there that communicates information about who you are and about who they are, and so it's a more effective form of communication to do it in purpose, to do it on purpose, to do it in person. Also, in terms of tools, the electronic tools, again, a double-edged sword. There's tools like GroupMe that allow things like you can put polls in the chat or something like that. So there are electronic tools that sort of facilitate in-person gatherings in a way that would be difficult otherwise. The person who takes the initiative to plan things is going to be doing a lot of people a big favor. Because especially if you think about the kind of person who they really have a strong interest in something, but they themselves don't have the bandwidth or capacity to facilitate a larger meeting. So if you find it within your interest to do something like this, you could be helping out a lot of other people to make friends by creating structures that allow friendships to exist in a way that they wouldn't unless you had done it. So I run several different groups at my church through GroupMe, and it's very encouraging to me to see people talk to each other that I don't think would do much talking to each other outside of the context in which we're currently in. So, yeah, there's a lot there. Talking about taking the conversation deeper. I'll also add that, well, people like to talk about themselves. And so I like to talk about myself. I know Enoch likes to talk about himself a lot. And so, it's an easy way to move the conversation, to ask someone about their day, and I'm fine. How are you? I'm fine. How are you? And you could be like, did you do anything fun this week? Or, what kind of hobbies have you got engaged in? And then whenever they tell you, you just say, well, you just ask a question about that thing. And that's an easy way to get to know someone because they want to tell you about the things that they're interested in. We could take a detour into why that's an important component in evangelism, because Jesus has done so much for us. We ought to be excited to tell other people about it. But that's certainly true for a lot of people and their hobbies. And so it's not like you have to be a psychologist to probe into someone's deep inner state as a part of building a friendships. It's just about finding things that people like and then asking them asking them to tell you about those things. If you do that enough, you might also have the opportunity to be a friendship facilitator. Maybe you are not super interested in the thing that they're interested in. But if you talk to enough people, you're eventually going to find two different people who are very interested in the same thing. And you have the opportunity to be like, You're telling me all this stuff. Have you talked to so and so, because he or she really likes all that stuff too,
Yeah.
and y'all should get together and talk about that stuff.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of opportunity in these relationship buildings, both to help yourself and to enrich your own life, but also to enrich the lives of the people in the community around you.
What is some advice that you would have for people who are more introverted for building friendships? So I tend to be more on the extroverted scale. I don't want to speak for you, but my sense is that you tend to be more on the introverted scale. Can you just give some advice for maybe some of our listeners who may not naturally just thrive in relational environments on how they can build friendships?
I am happy to share some things that have worked for me, with the disclaimer that I do not know that they will work for anyone else.
Mhm.
The first one is to just pretend. It helps me when I'm like, if someone invites me to an event the same day, I almost can't, because I haven't had time to prepare. But if I know an event is coming up where there's going to be a lot of people, but I know that I'm only going to be there for like 2 hours, I can start saying, okay, I can pretend like I am extroverted for 2 hours. I can do it. I can fake it. And so you go into that event and you just like, this is why I'm here. This is what I'm going to do. And then you just do it. And like, you're not, I haven't magically changed, but I know I'm old enough now to know how to talk to people. It's just a matter of spending the energy to do that. Another thing that helps me prepare for a situation like that is to block off time afterward where I know I'm not going to have to do anything like that. So in a sense, I reward myself with no people time whenever I'm specifically going to try to have people time. So because something that gives me a lot of anxiety is the idea that I would just go from event to event to event to event to event and meeting and hangouts, and then I would just die. Um, so having a like, okay, I'm going to do this, but then I'm going to do this, really helps me have a rhythm to my life that I find to be sustainable.
I appreciate you sharing that, Daniel, and also appreciate you putting up with me when we were roommates, putting up with all of the social activities that I would have, all the people that I would invite over to our apartment. And yeah, so I really appreciate you putting up with that. But I know there's a lot of our listeners who do happen to be more introverted that yeah, you probably relate and appreciate what you have to say. I also would suggest that just because somebody is good at talking with other people and kind of thriving in social environments does not at all mean that they have deep friendships. There are a lot of very social people who are ultimately very unknown and lonely. And so, yeah, maybe to our introverted friends, it's not always what it seems in terms of people, thriving out here. They seem so happy. They seem to be like they're having these so many connections and making so many friendships. That's not always the case with extroverts. And I think one of the things I've experienced with you, Daniel, having you as a friend, is that an introverted friend can be an immense gift to an extrovert because they just allow you to be present with them in a way that's very different than a lot of the extroverted people out there. They're not constantly demanding the focus on them. They're more comfortable in smaller environments. And yeah, so I would maybe some advice to our extroverts who are listening: try to make friends with an introvert, because that will maybe potentially be a benefit to the introvert where they don't have to make all the social effort, but it's also will be an immense gift to you because introverts can be incredibly thoughtful and also just very yeah, just can make you feel very comfortable in a friendship or a relationship. Do you want to speak to any of
Well,
that dynamic and how things have played out with your extroverted friends, Daniel?
yeah. Well, I'll say also that um, introvert and extrovert are real categories, but we do not have to be slaves to them. And so, you know, I'm definitely have all the hallmarks of an introverted person. But I'm if I'm in a room full of people at my church or something, part of what I'm thinking is, if Jesus were an introvert, what would Jesus's concern be in this environment? And one of the things that comes to my heart is, what about all the other introverts in here? You know, that I'm introvert and I'm suffering in this social setting, but there's probably other introverts who are suffering here too. So if I can go find them and reach out an olive branch and try to make it, because as an introvert, one of my fears is I'm standing in a room full of people alone, and I feel incredibly self-conscious because, like, I imagine other people like saying, "Oh, look at him, he's over there standing by himself, that's so sad," you know and so I try to, based on who I am, I try to imagine what other people might be like in that situation, and try to be a little bit of relief for them too. So there's a way to use, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, to turn those preferences around in a way that serves other people and serves the church. And again, it's worth pointing out that it's not like I've ever pretended to be extroverted and then later on deeply regretted it. In fact, the opposite has been far more true, that there's relationships that I've developed and information that I've learned and interesting stories that I've heard and funny jokes and everything else because I tried a little bit harder than I am inclined to try in these settings. So, um, something else I'll add too about the your point about extroverts often enjoying conversation but struggling with friendship is an interesting one that I think bears repeating too. It sort of discloses a bit of symbiotic relationship in any sort of community between those groups of people, where the introvert, you as an introvert, if that's who we're speaking to now, have the capacity to slow someone down a little bit and to go a little bit deeper than they might be otherwise inclined to do with their extroverted butterfly, flower to flower ways. So I think a lot of times extroverts are put on a pedestal and introverts are pitied at best. But both personality types have a lot to offer the other. And we're all better off if we've got a good mix of those people in our life.
Daniel, I think that's a good note to end our conversation on. And just as we conclude here, I just want to say thanks for being my friend. Thanks for making the effort to maintain our friendship. And yeah, I am. You are an immense blessing in my life, and I'm just super grateful for the chance to get to know you. And I'm excited again to see you in person this fall, but also excited to continue these conversations that we've been having today. So, listeners, again, thank you so much for listening. If these conversations are valuable to you, please share them. Please like this on whatever service you're listening or watching us on. And make sure you subscribe so you can be kept up to date about future episodes where we continue to talk about God and life.